The sun had already risen over Normandy, but the darkness of war still covered the land. Smoke drifted across the beaches like a ghost that refused to leave. The sea, once calm, was now stained by fire, steel, and sacrifice. For the men who had survived the first hours of the invasion, time no longer felt real. Minutes stretched into eternity. Every sound could mean death. On Omaha Beach, the nightmare continued. The sand was no longer just sand. It had become a battlefield soaked in courage and fear. Bodies lay where they had fallen. Weapons, helmets, and broken equipment were scattered everywhere. The wounded called for help, their voices carried by the cold wind. Yet, amid the chaos, something extraordinary was happening. Small groups of soldiers were rising from the ground, pushing forward despite everything. They were no longer thinking about strategy or victory. They were thinking about survival, about the man beside them, about the promise that they would not die in vain. Some crawled across the open beach, inch by inch, while bullets struck the sand around them. Others ran between explosions, knowing that stopping meant death. And slowly, the impossible began to happen. The German defenses, once terrifying and unstoppable, started to crack. Naval guns thundered from the sea, shaking the earth. Each explosion sent shockwaves through the cliffs. German bunkers that had seemed invincible now trembled under relentless bombardment. Engineers moved forward, clearing mines and cutting through barbed wire. Their work was silent but decisive. Without them, the invasion would fail. Behind them, more soldiers landed. Wave after wave. Fear after fear. Hope after hope. Many were young. Some had never seen combat before. But the moment their boots touched the sand, they became part of history. Meanwhile, far from the beaches, in the quiet fields of Normandy, another battle was unfolding. Paratroopers had landed during the night, scattered across the countryside. Some were alone, others had formed small groups. They fought in the darkness, using surprise as their greatest weapon. They captured bridges. They blocked roads. They destroyed communications. Every action created confusion. Every delay saved lives on the beaches. For the German command, the situation was becoming unclear. Reports arrived late or not at all. Some officers still believed this invasion was a deception. A fatal mistake. Because while they hesitated, the Allies grew stronger. By midday, the invasion had reached a critical turning point. The beach was no longer a killing zone alone. It was becoming a gateway. Allied soldiers climbed the cliffs, attacking from unexpected directions. German positions were surrounded. Some resisted to the last bullet, others retreated. The myth of invincibility was fading. In the sky, Allied aircraft ruled completely. Bombers and fighters attacked roads, convoys, and reinforcements. The once feared German Air Force was almost absent. On the ground, the cost remained unbearable. Every village was a battlefield. Civilians hid in fear as tanks and infantry advanced. Homes were destroyed. Families were divided. War had arrived. But so had hope. As the afternoon turned to evening, the Allies consolidated their positions. Supplies arrived, artillery was deployed, command structures were restored. The beachheads were secure, but victory was not yet certain. Thousands were dead. Thousands more would die. Yet their sacrifice had changed the course of history. For the first time in years, Nazi Germany faced a powerful enemy in the West. And far away, in the east, the Soviet advance continued after the disaster of Stalingrad. Germany was now trapped. Night fell over Normandy. The sounds of battle became distant echoes. Soldiers rested in trenches and ruined buildings. Some prayed, some wrote letters, some simply stared into the darkness, thinking about home. They knew the hardest days were still ahead. The Battle of Normandy would last weeks. Fields would become graves. Cities would burn. But the door to liberation had been opened. The beginning of the end had begun. And the world would never be the same again. As darkness covered the battlefield, German commanders finally understood the truth. This was not a diversion. This was the invasion. Reinforcements moved toward Normandy during the night. Tanks rolled across the roads. Soldiers prepared for counterattacks that could change everything. The Allies waited. Defensive lines were strengthened. Weapons were prepared. Every man knew that the next hours could decide the fate of the operation. At dawn, the battle resumed. German forces attacked with determination. Some units came dangerously close to breaking the Allied lines. But the moment had passed. Allied air power dominated the skies. Every movement during daylight was exposed. Convoys were destroyed. Tanks were attacked before reaching the front. Naval artillery continued to support the troops. And every hour, more soldiers arrived. More tanks. More supplies. The industrial strength of the Allied nations was now unstoppable. For Germany, time was running out. Fuel shortages, communication failures, and constant bombing weakened their response. Still, their soldiers fought with discipline and courage. The battle turned into a brutal war of endurance. Hedgerows became deadly fortresses. Snipers waited in silence. Artillery struck without warning. Progress was slow and costly. Rain and mud made movement difficult. But the Allies adapted. New tactics were created. New strategies were tested. And slowly, the German defenses began to collapse. In late July, the breakthrough came. Operation Cobra shattered the front. German forces retreated. The road to Paris opened. Soon, the City of Light would be free again. And all of it had begun on the beaches of Normandy. Today, those beaches are peaceful. Waves still reach the shore. The wind still carries whispers. But beneath that silence lies the memory of sacrifice. Cemeteries stand as reminders of the cost of freedom. Each name tells a story. Each cross represents a future that was never lived. The legacy of D-Day is not only about war. It is about courage. It is about unity. It is about ordinary people who refuse to surrender to darkness. Their echoes remain. And as long as history is remembered, they will never be forgotten. The days after June 6, 1944, were not filled with celebration. There were no victories yet. Only exhaustion. Only fear. Only the slow realization that the battle for Normandy would become one of the most brutal campaigns of the entire war. The beaches had been taken, but Normandy had not. For the Allied soldiers, survival now meant advancing through a landscape that seemed designed to kill them. The countryside of Normandy was beautiful. Green fields, stone houses, quiet farms. But hidden beneath this calm appearance was a deadly maze. Hedgerows. Thick, ancient walls of earth and vegetation divided every field. They blocked visibility. They slowed tanks. They created perfect ambush points. Every step forward was a gamble. Every field could be a trap. German forces used this terrain with deadly precision. Machine guns were hidden behind thick walls. Snipers waited patiently. Mines were buried in roads and fields. For the Allies, progress became painfully slow. Meters per day. Sometimes less. The war had changed. It was no longer a storm of movement like the Blitzkrieg. It had become a grinding war of endurance. Soldiers advanced, retreated, regrouped, and advanced again. Every village became a fortress. Every road was defended. And the cost continued to rise. Young men who had survived the beaches now faced weeks of constant danger. Sleep was rare, food was limited, the sound of artillery never stopped. Fear became normal. Death became familiar. And yet, something else grew stronger. Brotherhood. The bond between soldiers deepened with every battle. They shared fear, pain, and hope. They fought not only for their countries, but for each other. Many later said that this connection was the only thing that kept them moving forward. Meanwhile, the German army was also under immense pressure. They were fighting on two fronts. In the east, the Soviet advance continued relentlessly after the disaster at Stalingrad. In the west, the Allies were pushing deeper into France. Supplies were running low. Fuel was scarce. Reinforcements were limited. But German soldiers remained disciplined and dangerous. The battle for Normandy became a test of will. Air power gave the Allies a growing advantage. Bombers destroyed roads, railways, and communication lines. German movement during daylight became almost impossible. At night, the war continued. Artillery flashes lit the darkness. Patrols moved silently. Ambushes happened without warning. Time lost meaning. Days and nights blended together. Weeks passed. And still the front barely moved. For the Allied command, a breakthrough was essential. A new strategy was needed. Plans were created. Forces were reorganized. And in late July 1944, the moment finally arrived. Operation Cobra. A massive bombardment opened the attack. Thousands of bombs fell on German positions. The ground shook like an earthquake. Entire defensive lines were shattered. When the bombing stopped, Allied forces moved forward. This time, the German resistance was weaker. The line began to break. For the first time since the invasion, movement returned to the battlefield. The Allies advanced rapidly. German units retreated in disorder. Some were surrounded, others were destroyed. The collapse of the Normandy front had begun. Soon, the famous Falaise Pocket trapped thousands of German soldiers. It was one of the most devastating defeats for Nazi Germany in the West. The road to Paris was open. As Allied forces approached the city, the French resistance rose in rebellion. Streets became battlegrounds, barricades were built, German control weakened. And in August 1944, Paris was liberated. Crowds filled the streets. Tears, laughter, and celebration replaced years of fear. For the world, it was a powerful symbol. But the war was not over. The Allies continued toward Germany. The sacrifices of Normandy had made this possible. The invasion had not been just a battle. It had been the beginning of liberation, the turning point in the West, and the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. Even after the liberation of Paris, the consequences of D-Day continued to shape the war. The Western Front was now permanent. Germany was forced to divide its strength. Resources that once fueled expansion were now used only for survival. For the soldiers who had landed in Normandy, the journey continued through Belgium, the Netherlands, and eventually into Germany itself. The winter of 1944 brought new challenges. Cold, mud, snow, and one last desperate German counterattack. The Battle of the Bulge. It was a final attempt to change the course of the war. For a moment, it seemed possible. But the momentum created in Normandy could not be stopped. Allied forces held, and then advanced again. By 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. Cities were in ruins. Armies were exhausted. And the end was approaching. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. And the world had changed forever. The success of D-Day was one of the greatest military achievements in history. But more importantly, it was a human story. A story of courage in the face of fear. Of unity in the face of division. Of hope in the face of darkness. Today, when we walk on the beaches of Normandy, we do not only see sand and sea. We see memory. We see sacrifice. We see the echoes of those who gave everything for a future they would never know. Their voices are silent, but their legacy remains. And as long as freedom exists, their courage will never fade. Their story will never end. Because history is not only about the past, it is about the lessons we carry forward. And the reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity can rise.